Now again, notice that a tariff, a specific tariff of the value PIQ to PW would also reduce imports from M0 to M1. So we can accomplish the same thing in terms of imports with either an import quota or a tariff. There will be some important differences, but we can accomplish the same thing in either case. Okay. So now we want to think about the welfare effects. We know what the price effects are for a small country. It's going to raise the price. And again, it'll raise the price by exactly the same amount as a specific tariff would that reduces the volume of imports to the same level. So when we think about our consumer and producer surplus, we need to think about our various regions. So let's just label those A, B, C, D. Now, earlier we had tariff revenue. Now we have quota rents. So we have to be careful about what those quota rents are and who gets them. So the quota rents in this case, we have to remember quota rents are earned by the license holders. They get to buy the product at the world price and sell it in the economy, in the domestic economy at PIQ, but only the volume of imports that we actually have. So the quota rents will be given by Area C. Notice that that was also the same as the tariff revenue that we had in our tariff small country case from last time. So with this in mind, let's think about what the welfare effects are if the quota rents are earned inside the country. Earned inside the country. So if we look at consumer surplus, we would see the consumer surplus went down by the areas A, B, C, and D. Producer surplus went up by area A. And the quota rents earned in the United States were area C. So our net change then is minus B minus D. Look familiar? So we know that these two areas are our production and consumption distortions, because both production decisions and consumption decisions are being made at a government-influenced price rather than a free market price. Who actually got the quota rents? The license holders, but we have to be really careful here about how the government distributes the licenses and who they distribute them to. Let's suppose for the moment that the government gives the licenses away, and they give the licenses away to business firms. So if they give them to business firms, now remember these are business firms inside the country, right? Because we're assuming that these quota rents are earned inside the country. So that means that this amount of money is being earned by business firms. So in some sense, one could say the producer surplus is actually A plus C, right? They have the natural surplus because they get to expand production and to sell it at a higher price, but they're actually also getting this additional income because they can buy some of the product on the world market at a lower price and sell it at a higher price. Now the businesses that they give the licenses to do not have to be the same businesses that actually produce the product inside the country. Right? So the actual producers of peanuts may or may not be the firms that actually get the import licenses for peanuts. Okay. Now, the second thing, though, that the government could do is suppose the government auctions the import licenses off. So if the government is going to auction the import licenses off, then the quota rents are actually earned by the government. So in this case, an import quota that reduces imports by exactly the same amount as a tariff would will generate exactly the same revenue to the government. The tariff revenue and the quota rents that go to the government will be exactly the same size. So then, all we have to figure out is, well, what does the government do with its revenue? And as we said last time, we generally assume that it provides some set of goods and services or reduced taxes to the broad citizens, but it creates some sort of benefit for some constituency. Okay? Notice, however, that regardless of who gets the quota rents, this is unambiguously negative. Unambiguously. So it's unambiguously negative for the country. Okay. Now let's do the same exercise. But now we're going to assume that the quota rents are earned outside the country. Well, there's no difference in the consumer surplus. They still lose A, B, C, and D. There's no difference in terms of the producer surplus. But the quota rents earned in the U.S. are zero. We don't earn any quota rents in the U.S. So when we think about the net change, we still have our production and consumption distortions, but now we also have this transfer of quota rents to foreigners. Notice that this is also unambiguously negative, and this is a greater loss of economic welfare than in the case where you keep the quota rents domestically. Now, it's possible for the government to give the quota, to assign the quota licenses, not give, assign the quota licenses to foreigners, but not to transfer the quota rents to foreigners. And you do that by auctioning them off, right? So if the government auctions off the quota licenses to foreigners, foreigners still have to pay for them, and now we're back to our first situation. The quota rents are actually captured by the government and kept within the country. But if the government gives away quota licenses to either foreign governments or to foreign businesses, now the quota rents are going to flow outside the country. One of the most egregious import quotas that we have in the United States is on sugar. In the case of sugar, the import licenses are actually given away by the U.S. government to foreign governments, primarily Caribbean nations. Now you might think, wow, that's pretty stupid, right? The quota rents are going outside the country. That harms us even more than if we kept them inside the country. And of course, we're producing all of these production and consumption distortions. the reason that the government gives them to foreign governments is actually with the stipulation that the foreign governments will then auction those licenses off to private firms in their country. So notice that this is essentially a way for the foreign government to raise revenue. So in essence, the reason that the U.S. government does this is it's a hidden way of having foreign aid to relatively poor and developing sugar-producing countries. In some other instances, the licenses have been given away to individual companies with the requirement only that they be used within a certain country. This was particularly true prior to 2005 under something known as the Multi-Fiber Agreement, which said that a whole bunch of countries around the world owned import licenses, both for the United States and for the EU, for textile and apparel imports into the U.S. and to the EU. Again, we know that it's going to cause a much larger loss in U.S. economic welfare, but it was essentially a way of trying to generate more economic activity in relatively poor developing countries. So there may be considerations beyond just what's happening to U.S. economic welfare in terms of why you want to do some of these things. Now, one final thing here. Let's come back to here. And it shows up pretty well in this diagram. The quota rents, especially when they're assigned to foreigners, so we can think about the loss of economic welfare, this portion, C, is generally much bigger than B and D. That is, the quota rents are typically much more substantial than the production and the consumption distortions. Generally, order of magnitude of 3 to 4 to 1. So we're talking multiple orders of size. So when you do sign the quota rents outside the country, you're really talking about something fairly significant. Also notice that this transfer is actually from consumers, right, who are paying the higher price, to whoever owns the quota license. And it's also to producers. I mean, the producer surplus is coming from consumers, but the quota rents are coming from consumers in the form of higher prices as well. Okay. So a couple of things we can say, for sure. Unambiguously reduces economic welfare in a small country. The smaller the quota, the larger the reduction in economic welfare. So when we mean the smaller the quota, the smaller the volume of imports that are allowed in. So remember, the import quota could be 0, in which case no imports would be allowed in. 0 quotas do exist on lots of things. Not always enforced effectively, but they do exist on lots of things. Illegal drugs, as an example. Right? There's a 0 quota. You cannot legally bring them into the United States. So 0 quotas are out there. There is a redistribution of income from consumers to both producers and whoever owns the quota license. Or the quota rents, not the license, the quota rents. There is no price effect on the rest of the world. It's a small country. Notice that up to this point, the comparison with a tariff is fairly close. But there's one big difference. We may actually have welfare effects on the rest of the world. Even though this is a small country, the welfare effects can happen if we assign the quota rents outside the country. If foreigners are earning the quota rents, their economic welfare has been improved. Which always means that in the next life when you come back, you always want to be owning quota rents. Okay, now let's think about a large country. Again, we'll still think about the U.S. Now, in a large country, we know that we are going to raise the domestic price and lower the world price. So now we've got effects going in two different directions. Price effects going in two different directions. So if we decide to reduce imports from M0 to M1, we also know that that will raise the price. See if I can't line that up a little better, even if it's not a straight line. So by raising the price in the domestic economy to PIQ, we will also increase the quantity supplied, domestic quantity supplied, and reduce the domestic quantity demanded. But we're also going to lower the world price down to PW1. Okay, so we've increased the domestic price, reduced the world price, reduced the quantity demanded, and increased the quantity supplied by reducing the volume of imports. Okay. Now again, yes? Well, the foreign market is the world market here. Yeah. Yes.
Do you know by how much the price will reduce? Is it going to the same size?
No. You mean, well, the domestic price rise by the same amount that the world price falls?
Yeah. Will the world price fall by the same amount?
No. Probably not. And what would that depend upon? Well, the size of the country? Not really. Okay, so we can look at import, supply, and demand curves, right, to figure that out. So the one thing that we know is that if we're reducing our imports, the other country also has to be reducing, or the rest of the world has to be reducing its exports to us by the same amount. But that's not the key question. The key question had to do with what happens to the domestic price versus the world price. It depends upon the price elasticity of both demand and supply, both domestically and in the rest of the world. So it really depends upon how flat or steep these supply and demand curves are, and the supply and demand curves in the rest of the world, which means that it depends upon the price elasticities of the export supply and the import demand curves. Oh, that would be a great question. I have to write that one down. Okay, so let's think now about those. Think about the welfare effects of going on. So here, again, we need to identify the various areas that we have. So again, we need to think about what those quota rents are. And the quota rents, so this is the difference in the price. So the quota rents are the difference in the price times the volume of imports. So that's going to be area C plus area E. If you look back at the tariff analysis for a large country, you'll see that tariff revenue was also area C plus area E. So when a government auctions off the import licenses, it will receive all the quota rents, and therefore the import quota and a tariff reduce to exactly the same thing. So let's suppose that the quota rents now are being earned inside the country. Okay? Well, once again, we know that consumer surplus is going to fall by the increase in the price that they are faced with underneath the demand curve, which is areas A, B, C, and D. That's how much consumers are losing. Producers are gaining area A, and the quota rents that are being earned are area C and area E. So when we put it all together, we see that our net change is minus B minus D, our production and consumption distortions, definite negatives there, these first two terms, but this terms of trade effect from the import quota is clearly a positive for us. Remember, for our quota rents, we get to buy it at the world price, which we've driven down. So we're still buying it at that world price. We're selling it at whatever the domestic price is. So we earn that full difference on the volume of imports. So part of that is simply a transfer from consumers, area C, to somebody else inside the economy, whoever owns those licenses, the government or some other private individual or firm. But part of the quota rents is basically being paid by foreigners. We get to buy their goods at a lower price. So we have a positive terms of trade effect, pushing down the world price for this item. This, by the way, is the situation for sugar. So sugars are big import quota, as I mentioned earlier. We are a large enough producer and consumer of sugar relative to the size of the world market that it has, if we were to get rid of our import quotas, which haven't been changed since 1990, so it's been 20 years since the last time we had a change in the quota on sugar, would definitely have an effect on the world price. How big an effect is hard to know. Okay, so notice again, we've got an ambiguous effect. And it depends upon how much we can drive down the world price. Now, what if the quota rents are earned outside the United States, which, by the way, happens to be the case for sugar? So the change in consumer surplus is still the same. The change in producer surplus is still the same. There are no quota rents earned in the U.S. So we come back essentially to the same issue, or the same loss of economic welfare that we had for a small country. We've imposed a loss on the foreign producers as well, but they begin to recapture part of that because their exports, lower price, but they get to charge the higher price in the U.S. They've got the quota rents. So if we're interested in U.S. welfare, we can see that this is unambiguously negative. And once again, that C term, the quota rent part, is typically substantially bigger than production and consumption distortions. So assigning quota rents or allowing the quota rents to be earned outside the country are typically quite deleterious to economic welfare. So when we think about import quotas in this particular case, we need to think about a lot of different kinds of ramifications in terms of what might be happening here. So sugar is a good example of an import quota. So the price of sugar in the United States fluctuates generally from 5 to 10 times higher, not 5 or 10 cents higher, 5 to 10 times higher than the world price. You don't change your quota rent or your import licenses, import quotas, and you continue to grow your population, you have all sorts of things going on. So consumers are harmed by that. We, on average, spend, we don't know it very well, but we, on average, spend $2 per month more for sugar than if we were paying the world price for it. But we're not the only consumers of sugar, right? So who else consumes sugar? How about candy companies, right? So candy companies, Hershey's, M&M Mars, right? They consume lots of sugar, and what they find is for their domestic production, they have to buy domestic sugar. But at those prices for sugar, key ingredient in candy, that makes them non-competitive in the export market. Because the Swiss chocolate makers get to buy sugar at the world price. Actually, they don't, but let's assume that they do. So, because Europe's got weird things going on too. So foreign companies who can buy at the world price actually end up in a much better competitive position. So what does Hershey do? It fragments its market, right? It has domestic production for domestic sales, and it has